Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hopefully, everybody's had a great launch to the conference so far. Let's hear it for Jack Newton's keynote. Jack's in the back of the room. Good job, Jack. I understand that he covered some of our material today. Nice job, Jack. Couldn't have done it better myself, although I'm going to try to anyways. So, thank you for joining us. As I said, the objective of our presentation today is to explore the new legal trends report powered by Clio. As Jack mentioned in his talk, my name is Psiharis, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Clio. A little bit about what I do. In my role at Clio, I kind of do primarily three things. I work with Clio's many partners, which include bar associations, law schools, many of the integration vendors and sponsors that are here for the conference and supporting us, and IT consultants who work with law firms to take care of their IT needs and set up their infrastructure, right? We're all familiar with IT consultants. So a lot of work working with partners. The second thing I do is I work with our Dublin-based team. So we have a team based in Dublin that focuses on European market expansion, with particular emphasis on the UK, where we're seeing pretty rapid growth. Work with those guys, have lots of fun. And finally, and kind of most directly related to what we're going to cover today, I work with Clio's data operations team. So our data operations team does all kinds of analysis to inform us with data insights that are both internal and external at the company. And they're kind of behind the reports that we're looking at today. They've worked with the data, they've worked in using many of the techniques I'm going to describe to get us the insights that we're going to review. And I've been with Clio for about 6 years. It's been a wild ride. Was not quite there when Jack and Ryan took those weird, awkward-looking high school photos that he showed, but arrived on the scene when they still kind of looked more like they did in that photo that he showed in 2008 ABA Tech Show. It was around the time that I showed up. And in working with you guys, with law firms and with legal professionals over the last 6 years, I've developed a bit of a passion and a fascination with what we call KPIs, which stands for Key Performance Indicators. These are measures of how a law firm kind of like counts its business. They're also part of what I generally consider business operations for law firms. So one of the things that fascinates me about working with legal professionals is that they're incredibly intelligent. They're the finest thinkers in liberal arts. They're not particularly quantitative, and they get next to no business training, but otherwise run a business that they think about as a firm. So I always like to think of law firms as a business. I participate in running Clio's business, and that's kind of like my skewed perspective in the world. So here's our agenda for today, and what I'd really like to cover in a bit of additional detail to what you guys saw in the keynote. Obviously, we're going to look at data and look at the data trends that we described earlier today. I'm going to break this down into kind of 4 primary parts. The first is we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of data and benchmarking. Like, why does this matter? Why did we go to all this work? Why do we want you guys to review this stuff? And why is it so important? The second thing I'm going to discuss is our method for using data responsibly. So it's not something we covered in additional detail at the talk. We wanted to focus earlier on the data insights themselves, but I will talk a little bit about how we extract and use data. The third, of course, is going to be the all-important part, taking a slower look, slowing down and kind of taking a closer look, if you will, at the data insights that we put up on the screen for you a little while ago. And then finally, I'd like to conclude by pulling together a few ideas on moving closer to what I'd like to consider a data-driven profession. So that is our objective today, and if I can kind of sum it up in pictures, I think we're going to take one small step today toward looking like this when you run your law firm. How does that sound? Are you guys with me on this? Okay, all right, thank you. So where do we begin our story? Part 1, the need for data. Peter Drucker, hands up, who's ever heard of Peter Drucker before? That is more people than I expected. Way to go, guys. So Peter Drucker is well known. In the first half of the 20th century, he did foundational work in introducing all of us to the concept of measuring a business, quantifying business, and using what we call KPIs, which is considered pretty standard right now. His famous quote is, "What gets measured gets managed." And it often gets misquoted as what gets measured gets done. That's okay, that works too, and it captures the flavor of the insight. But that's where the story of trying to quantitatively assess a business begins. It's not new, it's certainly been around for a while. What's happened lately? Well, everybody's heard about big data. Jack promised not to use that buzzword, I'll try to do the same. The proliferation of internet technologies has created this explosion in the amount of data that is recorded. So this quote that's kind of circulating around on blogs and stuff is that we've created more data in the last 2 years than we did for the entire history of the human race before that. And the reason is because we're counting way more stuff. You click, you look, you view something, that's all being tracked in a way that in the past would require somebody to like follow you around and take a tally. That's happening through automated systems now, and that's the big thing behind this huge change in the way that data is collected and all these like big data things that you hear. So the one thing I'd like everybody to consider as part of this change is the shift from what we might call survey data or collected data. This is volunteered information, things that people respond in a questionnaire. Everybody remembers the government census, going door to door, like, to what we call source data or raw data. Essentially, without asking people and without having them like submit an entry or some kind of like data point, we can count stuff using internet technologies in a way that we've never been able to do in the past. And what it leads to is actually information that's surprisingly more accurate than what people volunteer about themselves. Kind of removes the human element. And if I look at professional services and how they use data and what sources of data are available to them, I kind of consider a few that maybe are parallels to law, among others. Things like healthcare, aviation, finance, economics, pharmaceuticals. There are data benchmarks, there are sources of information for you to use to benchmark yourself, to get current, to just look at stuff that's counted. We're all very familiar with, like, some of the more familiar examples might be things like the trend graphs that we see for stock markets, right? This is all published data that people can go and access and make real-time decisions based on getting access to information. If I think of kind of like the most extreme example of access to data and moving on it very quickly, I think of the offshoot of Wall Street that is known as high-frequency trading. So this is something that has also exploded in the last few years. Basically, we end up in situations where firms are competing for real estate in Manhattan so that they can get closer to where their transatlantic cable ends because they want to get their data microseconds faster than their competitors. Because it makes them a lot of money, because the computer makes a trade before a human can even think about it. Now, they're taking advantage of an arbitrage opportunity that I don't think exists in any way in law, but the greater idea is, what about the legal profession? Are we measuring our access to data in the microseconds? I certainly don't think so. Will we ever get there? Maybe not, but I think our current state of affairs is something that we need to improve in order to embrace the future of the profession. So these are demographic stats published by the American Bar Association that I pulled from their website last week. Some of the stats are updated. There are things that are updated as recently as 2016, but a few of them jump out at me as being most up to date in 2005. Now, the American Bar Association is fantastic. They do excellent work. The American Bar Foundation puts a ton of work into collecting all of these stats, and it's a really tough job. So, you know, that's not the point I'm making. It's more that we have professions that measure their access to data in microseconds, and then we have professions like law that are measuring their access to data in decades. That's a big difference, right? And, you know, just to have some fun with the point, 2005 doesn't sound like that long ago because it starts with 2000, but it was a really long time ago. The hot new phone was the Motorola Razr. You guys remember those commercials where they were like throwing them into walls? The best. It was a great ad campaign, but it was a long time ago. And these two brand new services that no one had ever heard of called YouTube and Gmail had just been launched. Gmail, as you might recall, was a private beta back then. And there was no commercial Google apps. None of the stuff that's revolutionized, but like kids these days don't even watch television because they're all watching YouTube. That was just launched in 2005. It's also like a small thing that happened around 2008 that I understand had some minor impacts on the economy and possibly the unit economics of practicing law. That happened 3 years later. But the other thing that's really happened since then is some of the stuff that's dominated our keynote presentations over the last couple of years. John Suh, the CEO of LegalZoom, was here last year. The year before that, we were very excited to have Richard Susskind, who's well known for publishing a book entitled The End of Lawyers, where he proposes that information technology will replace lawyers in providing legal advice in the not-so-distant future. And I think that this is kind of this underlying fear that grips a lot of people in legal practice. Are things going to change? Is this noble profession going to be commoditized? Is it going to be just going to a website or having some machine spit out legal answers to you? And certainly at Clio, that's not what we believe. What we believe this is doing is challenging us to build a data-driven law firm. Gone are the days where we can just pick our rates at random. Gone are the days where we can just kind of make it up as we go along from a business perspective. I think here are the days of what gets measured gets managed. And to do that, of course, we need data. That's our logical next step is, if we understand that things are changing, what can we do to help solve this problem? And certainly that's been the inspiration for the Legal Trends report that we've prepared at Clio. So our quest begins to get data. How do we get it, and how do we produce the insights that you guys are going to be reviewing? So in our quest to describe our responsible use and access of data, I'll start with what I call the lessons of 06-07. So in the infancy of using data and extracting it in the way that I'm describing here, Netflix and AOL both committed like big boo-boos on the way to doing this. So the first was AOL, who took a raw data set about search results and published it kind of like innocently for people to use to do data analysis. The problem is some intelligent researchers were able to de-anonymize that data and connect the search results with AOL user IDs. The second is Netflix, where they, if anyone recalls, had something called the Netflix Prize. This is where they publish a data set and challenge independent developers to come up with the recommendation algorithm that we see that suggests what you want to watch next early on in the history of their software. One of the data points they connected to was IMDb, which is the Internet Movie Database. And people quickly, two researchers actually at the University of Texas found a way to de-anonymize the data and link it to people's profiles in the other service. Those are great examples of exactly what we're not doing at Clio, and that's why I opened up with those. I think a lot of people, when they think about extracting data at scale, think about that, or examples like that. Is not in any way what we're up to. The first thing is we're not publishing any data sets or aggregate data for anyone to use, right? The reports they're publishing are just graphs. They're just like pictures, and you can't use those to de-anonymize who's who, or like when you look at those hourly rates, which one of you is charging them, right? We're not doing anything like that. And these lessons were learned in the data science community quite a while ago, so we're kind of far on from the infancy days of doing this kind of work. To describe our aggregation of data in a bit more detail, I'm going to walk through a few points. So to preserve anonymity when collecting and publishing our trends, these are the things that we've ensured that we do. The first is that no personally identifiable information is extracted or used. In other words, none of the data set we're looking at can be linked to your username, your user ID, your account number, or anything like that. It's aggregated and anonymized. The second thing I should make absolutely crystal clear is that no client information, nothing that you have to guarantee a reasonable expectation for privacy for, is ever accessible to us in the first place. So none of that is reviewed, none of that is extracted in the first place when we look at our aggregate information totals. The third I've kind of briefly touched on already, but everything is aggregated and anonymized. So we're looking at things like when we calculate utilization rates or realization rates, we're not logging in everybody's account and seeing what the realization rate was and then like averaging it. We're taking the total numbers from the whole profession and dividing them by other total numbers for the whole profession. And in doing so, that data is what you can consider anonymized and aggregated. An example of anonymization and aggregation, I think, that helps illustrate the point is the 18 default practice areas in Clio. So when you sign up for a Clio account, we pre-populate matters when you create them with a few like popular practice areas. And many of the graphs where we look at practice area breakdowns only feature those default practice areas. In creating a custom label, you could potentially put something in the label name that identifies you. So we group those into an other and don't make it discoverable, basically. That's an example of data anonymization and aggregation. Geolocation is another thing. So we've done, obviously, breakdowns by state, but that's where we cut off our level of granularity. So we look at data reported on the country and state levels only and don't go any further than that in the aggregation. And the last thing I'll remind everyone is that we collect this data for two reasons, and they're both very, very important. The first is obviously to publish trends that we're going to walk through and take a look at for the first time, I think, in the history of the profession. But the second is to make our product better, right? We're analyzing what you do because we need to see, like, where do you get stuck? What pages don't you use? What parts of Clio are awesome? What parts of Clio are dead? We need to be looking at kind of like aggregate trends and understanding how our users engage with the software. And it's the same process for us inside that we do to determine these things. So just to quickly illustrate with an analogy, I think a good example would be a tally counter. So if you've ever sometimes entered like a stadium or a concert or something, there's always somebody sitting there going click, click, click. They're tracking how many people enter through each entrance to keep a tally. And that's good. They're counting, they're getting data on like, turns out everybody went through gate E instead of gate A. That was weird. Let's figure out how to distribute that better. But they're not collecting names, social security numbers, all these personally identifiable data facts about you. They're just collecting something and aggregating a tally. They can't tell you the names of everybody who entered through that gate or anything like that. That's an example of how we're collecting data and aggregating it by doing tallies. One more example that I'll illustrate, and I think covers a different point, which is statistical estimation. Is anybody familiar with the German tank problem? That one's a bit more data science community specific. So basically, in the Second World War, Allied intelligence wanted to calculate the production capacity of German tanks. And they had some intelligence, but it was kind of like wildly being reported all over the place. So they used statistical estimation. It's specifically described as estimating a maximum distribution from sampling without replacement. That's a bunch of jargon. So what I'll say is calculating the total without counting each data point. So what they ended up doing is discovering that the tire tracks on tanks actually had sequential ordering because they all came from the same factory, and they'd find like broken down or abandoned tanks and basically estimate through the amount of time between them how many tanks had been produced. In April of 1942, they guessed that German production capacity was 275. After the war, when they reviewed the production logs, because Germans keep very accurate logs of stuff, 272. So they were pretty damn close. And that's in like the fog of war and in the craziness of World War II. Here's a way to think of an example of how we've done statistical estimation. We're going to review, and Jack mentioned earlier today, utilization rate. Now the fact is, I don't know how many hours a day each of you works. I have no idea. But we're going to do a statistical estimation on the basis that you work 8 hours a day, or we could look at it as 9 hours a day, 10 hours a day. We have to find a benchmark and then try to work our way backwards in performing a statistical estimation. That's an example of us kind of applying this mentality from the German tank problem, but it's also different from violating users' privacy, going to their account and seeing what they do all the time every day. And that's how we've ended up with a lot of the figures that you're going to see here, or at least some of them. Finally, we've added a new setting in your settings menu in Clio where if this really, really is important to you not to participate in aggregate data collection, you can opt out. This is just released here in time for the conference. We didn't want to tip you guys off about the surprise of the report, but we've built this into the software as something you can do. But I'll kind of circle back to the analogy we saw earlier today about connecting the engines for GE. I think it's such a great example. We have the ability to aggregate and anonymize your data in a way that will help you be data-driven in making decisions and help you deal with the changes that are coming through market pressures in the profession. And if we all disconnect, we're back to square one. And I think it's really important that I make my public service announcement appeal for everybody to consider not opting out from participating in the reporting. Okay. Do we have any questions so far? One, yes? Yes, so I'll repeat the question just so everyone can hear. The question was, if you aggregate stuff to the state level, if you only have a very small set of users in each state, isn't that potentially de-anonymized data? It's a great question. That's one of the reasons why we've waited until now to publish reports like these, in that we've just basically reached, I think, statistical significance and anonymity in all of the states that we cover. So there aren't any where really the user base is small enough for us to work backwards and reverse engineer that. Right. Is that true also? So repeat again, so everybody can hear. So the follow-on question was, what about countries? Certainly we wouldn't perform this type of aggregation until we have enough people to be statistically significant in the first place, by country as well, and that's part of the reason why the report today is only for the United States. That's where we have, right, the degree of statistical significance where we would feel comfortable publishing these trends. But those are very great and data-driven questions. Keep them coming. Okay. So is everybody ready to take another look at the data? We did a bit of a flyby last time. Let's jump into the main event. So two kind of general themes. One is indexing prices in the legal profession, which just isn't done, right? Like I think everybody has a gut feel for how much they should be charging, especially more experienced attorneys. But there isn't an actual data index out there, and that's what we've kind of called indexing the billable hour. So as Jack mentioned, the average price for an hour of legal services in the United States, as represented by Clio customers, came out at around $232 per hour. So that's one data point we can look at. First of all, like just spot rate, what's the price? What's the average price for me to understand? And of course, the next thing we can do is take this price and track it over time. Does it go up? Does it go down? This starts to look a little bit more like one of those stock indices, right, that we look at all the time. And as Jack mentioned, it's gone up, sort of. It's gone up, it's gone down, it's gone back up again, but it has trended up, right? Like we bottomed out at around $210 an hour. We're now seeing us go higher into the $230 an hour range. But why that's not entirely a good news story is because if you map it versus things like inflation, or what we've done in this case is map versus consumer price index, what CPI or consumer price index is is a measure of, an economic measure published at like the federal level of what prices people are paying for kind of like a standard basket of goods and services. So like fuel, food, shelter, like all these things are worked into this big index that maps how are prices doing over time. And you can see if we compare the two, it's actually lagging from where it should be, which means that yes, the number has gone up, but relative to the prices for other things, it hasn't gone up as much. And that's an important takeaway for us. And again, for me, the first time I've ever been able to look at anything like this and understanding the legal profession. The second thing we talked about was how this breaks down by geography. So again, we aggregated only to the state level. That's as granular as we got, but we're still able to perceive some interesting differences. At the high end, we've got DC followed by other sort of northeast states and what I'd consider to be population centers. DC came in at the highest at about $280 an hour. We'll circle back on DC later. We had some fun at Iowa's expense, but based on what we can tell, legal prices there are lower. And here's a way to interpret a data insight. As of today, I can't explain that phenomenon. I don't know why, right? It could be because of oversupply in the market. It could be because there isn't as much demand for legal services. Maybe the crime rate is lower. But the cool part for us is we can see a data insight and consider the process of starting to look at other things to understand maybe what they are and test for correlation as well. So maybe we'll see in states with, who knows, higher rates of business foundation and lower rates of crime, we see a higher rate. Like, we don't know that today, but these are the things we're going to work on and investigate further. And what breaking down by state tells us is where are interesting things to look at. Another fun way to look at this is as a heat map. So where are prices highest? We've kind of broken it down into 3 colors in terms of zones that we see ranging. And obviously, it maps mostly to population, right? Population drives prices. And what we would think is cost of living in those areas is higher, so legal is going to map to those pretty uniformly. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't necessarily. So our next map is based on data published by Forbes on how far $100 takes you. Like, what is the sort of bang for your buck for $100 in any given state? And you can see the numbers kind of called out there. And if there are 2 that I want to highlight in this exercise, let's look at Nevada and Utah. So they're neighboring states. $100 gets you $102 in Nevada on average, and it gets you $103 in Utah. Pretty comparable. But if we head back to the real price of legal services, there's a $60 an hour difference between those 2 states. So we've got evidence that the price for law and legal services doesn't map directly to the cost of living. There are probably other market factors at play, like all of the shit that people get into in Vegas. Woke you guys up with a swear word, didn't I? Didn't see that one coming. Okay. Finally, one thing that we can do that's also insightful is adjust our original hourly rate by the cost of living to come up with an adjusted rate. So basically, it's like take the previous number, divide it by 100, and multiply it by the price, and you have kind of like an adjusted for cost of living rate. And you can see that it gets pretty interesting. It's not mapped exactly like it was before. In relative terms, some states are higher, and this highlights the big difference between Utah and Nevada as an example. Oh, yeah, question.
Do you think that could be an impact? There might be more smaller firms in Utah and larger firms in Nevada?
So I'll repeat the question. One of the questions was, do you think it could be because we're seeing firms of different sizes, more small practices in Utah and more large practices, for example, in Nevada? That could absolutely be a factor. But in order to prove it, I'd have to test it with data. And that's exactly the kind of thing we'd look for, is like, what is the average firm size in a state, and how does it correlate to legal prices, and can we see relationships? So that's kind of like next level stuff that we'll get into once we've actually finished, not in today's presentation, but in the future of the trends report. But another excellent data-driven question. The data-driven firm is taking root right in front of us. Okay, the top 10 states by billable hour. This is just summarizing kind of what we saw in that table chart earlier to illustrate the point. So keep track of DC. We see $281 an hour, followed by New York and Connecticut, California, and Nevada. The top 10 states by real billable hour. This is prices versus cost of living. Nevada, Connecticut, Illinois, New York, and Arkansas rocketing into the top 5. How is this interesting, and how can I understand better? Well, am I looking to expand my practice into a new state? Am I a new law grad trying to decide where to take the bar exam and where to set up my own solo practice? These are probably things I'd want to look at least to feel better informed in making my decision. And of course, on the flip side, the bottom 10 states, we've got Iowa, West Virginia, Montana, Maine, and Kansas. But when we adjust for the real billable hour, we still see Iowa in last place with West Virginia, Maine, Montana, and Vermont dropping a little bit. So less movement on this side, but still something, for me at least, interesting to look at for the very first time. The next thing we looked at was hourly rate by practice area. So in here, what we're testing for are variances based on what types of areas of law people are concentrating in. And we can see that there is pretty substantial variance. And we have criminal, personal injury, insurance, and family coming in the sort of like bottom four. These are national averages, of course. These are not adjusted for geography. Something that might be the case here, it's a bit early for me to tell, but it looks like, obviously, what we call B2C services or business-to-consumer services are on the lower end of the practice area pricing, and more traditionally B2B-oriented stuff might be ending up slightly higher in terms of average areas. But again, these are things we'd have to explore further, and breaking things down like this gives us a place to look to get started, gives us a kind of like insight into where we'd want to dive in deeper. Some other fun stuff, just for fun for me, what day of the week do people bill their hours on? So if we look at by day of week, we're all a little bit more chill on Fridays. Lawyers are the same, but generally pretty uniform, with Tuesday being the biggest day in terms of billables that come in. Put that one in the fun fact category. So this next one, this is a graph of fee structure by practice area, expressed as a percentage of revenue. So this is in terms of the dollars billed in each of these practice areas, what was the fee structure in place? You can see it's primarily, in Clio at least, hourly and flat fee, where the divisions are taking place. There's a bit of contingency in personal injury, but I think we've only recently added that as an explicit option in our software, so that should be higher. But if we kind of zoom in a little bit, what I'd be interested in looking at is where we have evidence of primarily flat fees occurring, at least as expressed in the way that people are using Clio. So immigration, I think, is generally regarded as a place where flat fees are pretty standard. I don't think we're surprised to see that there. But interesting to see a few others. Criminal, definitely a lot of presence of flat fees. Wills, bankruptcy, to a lesser extent commercial. We're starting to see alternative fee arrangements definitely come in a lot more. Yes, question?
When we talk about bankruptcy, we're talking about the whole amalgam of corporate and personal, or just personal or corporate?
It's a great question. So the question was, when we talk about bankruptcy, are we talking about personal and corporate? The answer to that is we're talking about every matter that somebody has selected bankruptcy for. So it would be an amalgamation, and it's part of that aggregation, right? We don't have visibility into those two subcategories. But yeah, that'd be a thing for us to try to ascertain as well. Another German tank problem for us to try to solve. Okay, so that kind of concludes the index portion where I talk about, let's look at law almost like a price index and see what we can learn, or at least what we can be better informed by. The next thing I very quickly want to touch on is seasonality. So seasonality is kind of something that's particularly important in the marketing community. Basically, you want to understand if there are like consumption patterns that change. Obviously in retail, like the period of time from Black Friday until the holidays is like there's a huge seasonality effect. And it kind of tells you when to market for your services. It's like if I'm going to go out and try to get clients or get new business, when's my best? When are the fish biting? You know, when do I go out there? But it also lets us test some myths that I thought we'd have some fun with. So one of the ones that my friends in family law always tell me is that people wait until after the holidays to get divorced. Well, I've thought that was not true. And then we ran some seasonality. Obviously, these are all family law matters, so we haven't broken them down specifically into divorces. But there's a pretty big spike that happens in the first 3 months of the year that then kind of wanes as the course of the year goes on. So maybe some evidence of that taking place. Yes, question?
So this is tracking billable time, right?
Oh, that's a great question. No, this is number of matters opened by month.
So I'm thinking, you know, correlation, causality.
Yep.
You know, I take a lot more time off during the holidays, and I'm going to bring in fewer clients.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'll repeat again, the correlation causality, we were saying obviously people take more time off over the holidays and they would be bringing in fewer clients as well. Absolutely. Over the summer holidays as well. So, you know, I can't universally declare that it's people all getting divorced in the first third of the year, but I also haven't ruled it out. This one I had some fun with. This is the most extreme case of seasonality, and it's a human condition of leaving things to the last minute. I wonder what happens in March and April. But tax law seasonality is pretty heavy, and of course, how you choose to staff your firm and all that kind of stuff, if you practice tax law, is going to be pretty important to be built around tax season. And then we see some practice areas where I think we see the drop-off related to the holidays that we just mentioned, but really it's more evenly distributed. February is a bit of a drop, but that's because of fewer business days in a shorter month, and I'd look at that and say there isn't as much evidence of seasonality in personal injury. People hurt themselves all the time. But those are some insights into the types of things we can check for that we'll continue to look for and deliver as possibly informative. And again, part of the business use case for that is, when do I market for my services? When do I throw some money into Google AdWords or something I can pay for to try to get out in front of people? Yes, question?
That's great, and obviously for an industry that hasn't had a lot of data. Is there any plans to correlate any of this to client value, client satisfaction? Because at the end of the day, we're serving clients.
Yes. So I'll quickly repeat the question. The question was, is there any plan for us to sort of correlate some of this stuff to client satisfaction, or what you might consider metrics built around how clients are experiencing services, whether it be seasonality or all these kinds of things? I think it would be ambitious, for sure. Like, Clio is not exactly the system of record for client satisfaction, but I could see us rolling out something like a net promoter score, where we can track, how likely are you to recommend my law firm services to a close connection, and possibly testing for correlation there. But there would be some work involved in setting that up and collecting. But I love the way you're thinking about it. So the next thing I want to dive into are law firm KPIs. Jack mentioned a few of these: utilization rate, realization rate, and collection rate. I'll describe them again because we did a pretty rapid flyby the first time around. So very simply put, you can think about total hours in a workday. Your utilization rate is how many of those hours did I turn into something that was billable. Your realization rate is what did I actually bill for? So the work that was billable, how many of those things ended up on my invoice that I sent to my client? And finally, collection rate is about getting paid. I meet attorneys all the time who are excited to get their bills out the door, and I'm always thinking, wait until they pay you to get excited. Money in the bank is different from money that people owe you. Of course, everyone in the room understands that pain, I'm sure. So the first thing to cover very briefly, utilization rate. This is a measure of chargeable hours divided by available hours. As Jack mentioned, most industry samplings of self-reported data peg even solo and small firm attorneys as putting themselves at about 60% utilization rate. And we were pretty surprised to find a utilization rate of 28%. To be honest, we were hoping for some story that lawyers who use Clio are way more productive than lawyers who don't. But I think we came up with a better one, which is data insights will surprise you, and this is why having data is important, because sometimes our gut feel doesn't check out and doesn't add up. And it's a classic case to me of the difference between survey data and source data or raw data that we described earlier. As we mentioned earlier, utilization rate definitely varies by state. Can't quite explain what's going on in Rhode Island. Maybe a lot of cool things to do. And good on you, Nebraska, for leading the way in a big way. Midwest working thing, could be, right? But this is where we have fun with this data, is we don't know, right? We don't know what the factors are at play, but we know where to start investigating further. Maybe we'll interview some Midwest lawyers and find out how they're more efficient, and then interview some Rhode Island lawyers and figure out where they're spending their time. But another thing that I think was very interesting to us was this utilization rate. So when we map by number of attorneys in the law firm, I hear all the time that people have trouble, they hit sort of like a glass ceiling when they get to kind of 7, 8, 10 attorneys in their firm. And I'm not surprised to find that utilization rate isn't necessarily just going straight up and to the right in terms of a ratio. I'm also not surprised to see that solos are coming in at a 22% utilization rate. If you think about it, when you run your own business on your own, there are a million things for you to be doing outside of just doing legal services. I think was there a question? Yep.
In calculating the utilization rate, where are you using to create the number of hours worked? I mean, I can see the billable hours you would, of course, be able to pull from Clio, but is that self-reported?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question very briefly. The question was, in calculating the utilization rate, what are we using to report the total number of available hours? So for that one, I'll circle back to the German tank problem. This is a statistical estimation, and what we've done is assumed an 8-hour workday, netted out holidays, and also this is only reported for hourly work. So with a flat fee, it's not possible for us to really know what this ratio is. So the flat fee stuff is excluded from both the numerator and the denominator. It's just not part of the calculation. And so this plateau is really interesting. Like, it could be one of the explanations for why firms have some trouble getting past this growth size, is because there aren't these economies of scale in the same way that there are in adding a second or third attorney, and then likewise by going past 10. So definitely something pretty interesting, and this was really something that jumped off the page to us. So just to quickly summarize observations. If we compare source data to survey data, we see that a lot of people aren't as efficient as they think they are, and I think that's a big takeaway and an important one. Geography matters, and there do appear to be economies of scale to adding people to your law firm, but they're not uniform, which is really, really, really interesting. So the second one is realization rate. We described that this is the value of billed hours divided by the value of utilized hours. Yes, question?
On the utilization rate, did you try to correlate with the number of staff persons that they had? Because that would certainly maybe answer some of those questions.
Yes, so excellent question. For the utilization rate, did we try to correlate versus staff, so how many support staff people had? The answer there is no, because we don't necessarily know how many staff people have at their firm. We can only look at how many lawyer licenses and how many Clio licenses in total are active. So the other thing we can adjust for that's really important is if someone's got 10 staff but they only have 2 Clio licenses, no way for us to know that, right? So that's kind of, again, goes into statistical estimation. The thing is, when the data set gets big enough, a lot of that stuff can even out, and that's kind of where we're at right now. We also did outlier exclusion to kind of remove some of the really wacky outliers out there. So we mentioned this, that the total realization rate, this is hours that were billable that ended up on bills, was 81%. Not bad. I think not bad, especially given a lot of the price pressures we see on law. And when we examine realization rate by state, it's a bit more uniform in terms of distribution, with a couple of outliers in West Virginia, Delaware, and this one I find really interesting, DC. There's no point charging really high rates if you don't put them on your bills. But I'm kind of curious, like, if we're going to see a lot of these patterns develop where people kind of like tighten the bolts on one part of this funnel and then spring leaks in other parts of the funnel. Again, warrants further analysis and further understanding, but definitely interesting to see a top state in terms of price be in the bottom end of the spectrum in terms of realization rate. Realization rate by practice area as well. Personal injury, administrative and employment law, kind of rounding out the bottom. And then I would say a slightly more uniform distribution over the top, but I would take a look at this and kind of want to dive into understanding more about why we see lower realization rates for the bottom 3 and possibly the highest 3 as well. Just kind of dive into those and understand what's different about both the market economics and the work being done. But again, data insights that advise us on where to look further. So we see bigger differences by practice area than we do by geography, I'd say, with the exception of a couple of states. And my kind of takeaway here is it's not all what Charlie Sheen would call winning, right? There are states that charge more money, but that realize less of that revenue, which doesn't solve the problem at the end of the day. And that's why thinking about this funnel and these metrics is really important. Our final one is collection rate. And to me, this is the most important. This is about getting paid. You do all the work, you produce the bills, you get them out the door. Are you getting paid? It's the single most important ratio. As we mentioned, this is total collected revenue over the value of the billed hours that were put on invoices and sent to clients. And the total collection rate was the highest of the 3 ratios so far at 86%, and higher than I expected. If we look at collection rate by state, Jack already had some fun at the expense of Wyoming, but I'll add, I thought Cowboys paid their bills. Same. But that's clearly interesting. Could be some kind of outlier effect, or could be something for us to understand more about what's going on in the state. But collection rates, I'd say, a lot more uniform. We see almost every other state falling between 80 and 90% in terms of collection rate. Collection rate by practice area, again, pretty uniform, like not as much variability here as we saw in things like utilization rate, which I find interesting. And then the final point for us on the collection rate topic is time to first payment. So for people using Clio Payments, which is our online credit card processing platform, we saw the time for them receiving the first payment of their bill, not the entire payment, but the first payment on their bill, pretty drastically reduced. And I think kind of makes sense when you think about it. If you're making it easier for people to find ways to pay down funds, of course it's not uniformly applicable to every practice area or every fee arrangement or every type of client. And it's early days yet for this data set, but still a little evidence that you can get paid faster and easier by switching to doing some credit card processing. In a way, I think that easily makes up for any kind of fee you'd be paying to do the credit card processing itself. So here are kind of my observations on the data set here. Collection rate is the best performing ratio for law firms using Clio. Variances by practice area and state exist, but are not as pronounced as we saw in other data sets. And my own personal take is if you don't offer online credit card payments and you can, you should. Think about utilization rate. What is one of the things you could be doing that's wasting away the day? Well, wrangling people down, tracking them down, trying to get them to pay your bills, or dealing with issues in collections, such that your collection rate might look okay, but if it's taking forever for you to get them to actually pay the bills, your utilization rate suffers because there's time going toward that instead of toward doing billable legal work. Okay, I'll pause. Question?
Yeah, I've got a question. How does the picture look when you take all three KPIs into account? So not just one of them in isolation, but through the entire funnel.
So the question was, how does the entire funnel look when you take all three KPIs into account? Jack had a slide on that in his keynote, actually, where we kind of looked at what the chunks were in terms of what you can make. So the way we expressed that was, if you take an 8-hour workday, what does it end up being at the end of this funnel? It was about 1.4 collected hours, of course, assuming that everybody does hourly work. So yeah, that's kind of the breakdown in that regard, is you're going from an 8-hour workday and collecting on about 1.4 hours in terms of total efficiency of this funnel. Yep. Yes, future consideration. So repeat the question, but just basically, are we considering taking a closer look as well at flat fees in the same way that we've broken down hourly work? Absolutely. Don't have that ready for this ClioCon, but probably in one of our earlier versions of the published version of the report that we'll do. Certainly something we'll want to dive into. Absolutely. Yes?
How do you define your actual sample size that you're putting into your data set in order to obtain your calculations?
So the question was, how do we define our sample size that we use to make these calculations? Effectively, it's everyone who's a paid Clio customer in the United States, netting out outliers. So there's like I mentioned, a systematic outlier exclusion that takes place, which is part of kind of regular statistical analysis. You're always wanting to smooth out the data set and exclude outliers. Yes. That's a great point. So the question was, how do we come up with the practice areas? These are just the defaults that are listed, and we also have an other category that we haven't published much on here, but that we will kind of consider bucketing. So a lot of people do create custom practice areas in Clio, but for the moment we have just the default ones, which, yeah, maybe could use a bit of an update or be more granular. Go to the product lab, tell them I sent you. But seriously, that's a great point and something that I think, as part of our Project Apollo, could very well be worked in. So let me ask the group, which insight stood out to everybody the most? If you had to pick one.
That we only captured 25%.
Absolutely.
Of billable time in a day.
I agree. I mean, hey, everybody has their opinion on what stands out, but the utilization rate, as Jack mentioned, if we think about where are my opportunities to kick something into warp speed, this is an homage to Newton Govero Aerospace, of course, now defunct Newton Govero Aerospace, but where are my huge opportunities for upside? And if there's one data insight for us to act on, it's in that utilization rate, right? Sure, we can make incremental gains and do better. I'm sure time to collection will be an interesting metric that we might look at more, because there's collection rate, but there's also did it take 2 years versus 5 minutes, which is important. But if I think of where we can get started, the obvious place for me is utilization rate. I think a big part of solving the utilization rate challenge comes from what a lot of companies consider automation. So I think an important part of the Amazon story that Jack told us earlier is not just that they're using data to inform themselves, is that they're automated as heck, right? Like they can get this stuff shipped in a distribution center close to you, mostly through the use of robots, right, in a very, very quick amount of time. And if I look at a law firm sort of as a system, or going back to this concept, not of KPIs, but of business operations for a law firm, there's a lot of stuff outside of giving competent and accurate legal advice that takes place. You have to market and get people to become clients. You have to track and man phone systems and inquiries and all this kind of stuff. You basically go through what the sales community calls leads and try to convert them to clients, people who inquire, and converting them into people who are actually retaining your services. You have to go through this funnel that we talked about to generate revenue, and then of course you have to collect on it and understand if you made that money. So I look at this as like a step-by-step process, and there's a ton of automation I think that's possible there. A great example would be we have a document automation function in Clio. Lawyers prepare a lot of documents, as I understand it. Only 15% of our users actually use it. That blows my mind, because there's such an opportunity to automate something that is time-consuming, that probably would deliver better client value if it was faster and cheaper to do, but that we're not thinking about this way of like, how's my utilization going, and am I like saving time in doing something? And I think that's a good insight or example. A few others, I think, like the upgrades to the mobile apps we talked about. Using mobile apps is about doing things faster. And if you shave time off of even things that don't seem very substantial and make yourself faster, that all can build back into improving your utilization rate. But in order to uncover those opportunities, I go back to the whole like GE plugging the engines in and doing the data analysis so that our law firms aren't all flying on their own, but that they're connected to a hub. We need to be able to have this data and do these insights, otherwise we won't know where to look. And we're just getting started, is the other thing I'll add, right? Like this is a first pass at something that I think will become a very important part of how lawyers educate themselves on making data-driven decisions. And in terms of where we go from here, first step for us is to publish. So we put these insights together, and you guys are the world's first to look at them and to ask me these questions, right? This is the first time, I think, it's audacious of me to say, but I think the first time in the 4,000-year profession, a guy like me has been able to talk to some folks like you and address you with data on what it is that you do, or at least that describes certain aspects of what you do. So our first step is to publish and get these reports in your hands and start collecting feedback, right? Like the questions you've asked me today are tip of the iceberg, and I think that they will incite a discussion and an academic discourse even that'll enable us to ask better questions, because the questions you're gonna ask are gonna be ones that then we go and try to answer. The next thing for us is to continue to build this into our product. So we discussed today the release of advanced tasks. Very important. This is the kind of thing that helps automate stuff. Like, where did we come up with this from? Well, we work backwards from thinking about how do we help a lawyer improve their utilization rate? How do we help a firm get more efficient at what they do? Making tasks a little bit more structured and automated probably will help do that. And I mentioned the mobile apps again as well, but making this faster to use and not making you open up the Clio web app to do every single little thing through an advanced mobile experience is another way that we can make sure that happens. Finally, I think the other thing that's needed is additional thought leadership. So I've gotten to tour lots of North America and now increasingly Europe, talked to lawyers, done speaking engagements like these. You guys are a pretty advanced crowd. You're asking me questions about data and business in a way that I think is further ahead than some of you know versus the rest of the profession. And I think in order to get to the place where we need in being data-driven, we're gonna require a lot more thought leadership. And that's certainly part of our strategic roadmap at Clio, is to try to not just publish a report and let it sit there, but to do active thought leadership and getting out there and educating people on thinking about business, on running their law firm like a business, on thinking like Peter Drucker and saying what gets measured gets managed, so how can I measure stuff? And together, we'll take that step we talked about toward looking a little bit more like this every time when you run your law firm. So that brings us to our end. Thank you. I imagine there are going to be some questions, so I'll definitely start the Q&A with everybody. But thank you. Yes.
Can I just get more, can you
right? So the question was, what's the denominator and how did we get to the number of the total working days in the year? We did 8-hour workday, less federal holidays, less average of 2 weeks vacation. Yeah. So as I described in the German tank problem, right, this is a statistical estimation where we're getting close, but there's no actual way for us to know.
Are you using a Canadian or American holiday?
American holidays. Good one, though. Yes?
Is there any way to filter that through the amount of logins that the users actually log in? So meaning, would we get better data if we filtered that through how many times the Clio user logs in?
So the question was, would the data quality improve based on how many times the user logs in effectively, right? Like does a person who's an daily active user, as we'd say in software, give us a better sort of data set to work from? Maybe, but that's one level past the aggregation and anonymization that we do, right? So we're not connecting this data with anybody's like specific usage pattern in Clio to be able to test. So maybe one thing we could do is kind of put users into bins where it's like you're a daily active user, you're a somewhat active user, and kind of create categories and test for correlation there. But that's probably the best we could do while maintaining the privacy that we want to. But another great data-driven question. Yes? Sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't quite hear that one. Yes, so the question was, can we look at this data in sort of like a box and whisper plot, or even like scatter plots of the trend lines? Yes, in the published report, we're probably going to include stuff like that. I just wanted to err on the side of a little bit more simple interpretations of data to test. Part of the objective today, too, was to test what level of comfort people had with reviewing data in terms of like the actual diagrams and if they could follow along. And so far, I'm pleasantly surprised and happy. So yeah, definitely we could do some more advanced breakdowns and representations visually. Yes?
I was going to say, for metropolitan area versus rural.
Yes. That's a great point. We'd have to kind of harangue around the geographic anonymity, so we need to get more granular, but just so everybody could hear, the request was, let's look at metropolitan versus rural information, right? Obviously, that's going to be something that impacts the state-by-state comparisons if they're primarily urban, and prices, of course, are going to vary a lot between New York City, downtown Manhattan, and upstate New York, right? So, yeah, great point. It could be something we build into in the future. Yes?
I'm just not getting my brain around this 28%. And I'm a law firm bookkeeper, so I look at the billable rates and the bills for a lot of different small and small law firms. And I'm not thinking that that's true for my particular clients, and yet my clients are on, they're your typical
Right.
customers. So I'm just not, how do you explain that? And I guess the other thing I'd ask of the lawyers in this room, raise your hand. Does that seem really low? Do you feel like you bill more than, that's 2 hours a day?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you actually collect 2 hours a day more, right? When I'm a solo, no.
Yeah.
I think there's got to be some real outliers in those stats.
I think there are, and it is a national average too, right? So think about the fact that it's like rural, there are going to be people who are working part-time, so it could be,
That's
yeah,
true. I have clients who are, stay-at-home moms and they,
exactly. So statistical estimation to get close. The utilization rate would be the toughest one, because for all the other metrics, we have what we need to make a data-driven calculation. But for utilization rate, it's always going to be scrappy to try to figure out how many available hours do people have, for sure.
This is actually pretty consistent, though, with the guy from LegalZoom last year.
Yeah.
I mean, you averaged, was it a solo average is what, 397 billable hours, 67,000. So we're probably a little more savvy than that, I would hope. But
I would say so, right? Like, so there are some other data points that suggest it's lower than you might think, and this is one of those like data insight surprise you moments. I'd also say that, hey, look, everybody here is in the category of, if you're from out of town at least, like enough disposable income to make the trip, a pretty high level of engagement with the software, probably a reasonably successful practice. I think the room is actually filled with people who are very different from the tens of thousands of people we have that we calculated this utilization rate on. What I'm saying is basically there's a selection bias in the room here at the conference possibly as well. But it doesn't necessarily explain, right? Like it's certainly something worth more consideration from us. Yes?
But that's a legitimate question. If you have people who use Clio regularly and they, the data integrity matters if you're drawing
And I only use it 2 hours because the uptake is difficult, then any data you draw off of me is useless.
But the data we're drawing is how much time you tracked in your practice, not how much time you actually opened up your Clio account and logged in.
I guess what I'm saying, how are you filtering out the people who only half-ass Clio?
Outlier extraction, right? So like there will be a certain percentage of people who just have generally weird results, including like that seem to use the software one day a month or one day a year. So we've definitely excluded them in the outlier analysis. Yeah, but I would push back a little on the point that we shouldn't be looking at the data from. That's part of what a benchmarking and index does for us, right? Is we do need to look at the people who are, to be honest, practicing law out of the trunk of their car. And having all the kind of like substance abuse issues that we see popping up in law. Like, yeah, I bet you their utilization rate is 20 to 25%. And that's part of the data set, right? Like it's kind of important to be inclusive of that as well. But I get the point you're making, which is it doesn't necessarily give you the business advice you're looking for, which is fair.
I'm an alcoholic because I only get 25%.
No, definitely not. Okay, yeah, let's put that one on Twitter. Thanks, gang. And he's fired. Yep. But yeah, I think like that's the other thing that's interesting is so many different types of data points are being collected in a way that like those people would never participate in the Lexis surveys, would never be included at all. Yet we have lots of customers, especially in like rural outlying regions. I was a little while ago at the Washington State Bar Solo and Small Firm Conference, which happened in this place called Ocean Shores. Don't go. And ran into an attorney who like didn't have enough gas in his car to get back to Seattle, right? He's using Clio every day. So I'm guessing his utilization rate probably, it looks a lot different from everybody who's in the room, but he's still licensed to practice, right? And is using Clio every day. So it's an interesting challenge, and certainly one as we get deeper into indexing the profession, we would need to figure out how to address or how to kind of like identify. And I'm looking forward to working on it, but it's not gonna be easy. Yes.
A question, you talked about countries outside of the US that you're currently doing the same, you're collecting that data. Is there any way to give us like a projection, like a timeline where we'll be able to have something that we can actually have a look at?
Sell everybody Clio in your home market, and I'll get you a projection. It's tough to tell, right? I think, yes, projections would be that the UK and Australia will be the most likely next markets for us to be able to do this kind of analysis on, and we're getting close, but even then it would be kind of country level. It would be tough to break it down by practice area and have enough data points for us to feel really good about the outputs that are coming. So I'd say give us a couple of years, like 2 years. Yeah, I think, and we'll get there with enough comfort that we're not de-anonymizing anybody's data. You know, when you have 10 firms in Amsterdam, right? Like you can, it becomes difficult to anonymize and aggregate, but we could be doing some interesting stuff there as well. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.